Muito boa tarde a todos e todas, os que nos seguem, quer aqui presencialmente no ISCTE, nesta sala, quer também àqueles que nos seguem a partir do ambiente virtual, na internet, para esta aula aberta, que constitui uma conferência com o professor Geert Bouckaert. É com grande prazer que damos início a esta aula do Mestrado em Administração Pública do ISCTE, numa iniciativa organizada conjuntamente, quer pelo ISCTE, Centro de Investigação em Estudos em Sociologia, o CIES, e conjuntamente também com o Instituto de Políticas Públicas e Sociais, o IPPS. O mestrado de Administração Pública do ISCTE é um mestrado com uma longa tradição. Estes momentos são sempre uma oportunidade de partilha de conhecimento, não só para dentro da comunidade do ISCTE, mas também de partilha de conhecimento com a administração pública portuguesa e de outros países de expressão de língua portuguesa, mas também uma oportunidade para qualquer pessoa em qualquer parte do mundo, a partir da internet, possa seguir, quer em direto como hoje, quer depois a posteriori, aquilo que são os ensinamentos, as partilhas de conhecimento que proporcionamos a partir do ISCTE. O professor Geert Bouckaert é um docente também deste mestrado e é com bastante honra, orgulho que temos a oportunidade de o ter aqui. Vou continuar agora em inglês. I will proceed now in English. Today we have the honor of hosting one of the most distinguished scholars in public administration, Professor Geert Bouckaert, with a distinguished career and valuable contributions to the study and practice of public administration. Professor Bouckaert serves as an inspiration to all of us. He's an emeritus professor at the Institute of Public Governance at Leuven University in Belgium. He brings a global perspective to the challenges of public administration, and he promotes a deep understanding of how administrative models can respond to the current challenges, combining hierarchical models like a Weberian approach, but also market demands and collaborative networks. The model and the topic of the session of today was developed in the past in collaboration with another remarkable public administration professor who unfortunately is no longer with us, but left also a significant legacy that Professor Bouckaert continues to build upon. And it's time, I think, also to pay a tribute to the Professor Christophe Pollitt. Professor Bouckaert research and teachings on public sector reforms, performance management, government innovation, and have shaped thinking and practice in various administrations and governments worldwide. Professor Geert, dear friend, dear professors of ISCTE, community of professors, civil servants in the room, students, also online. I know that there are also people from other countries following us online. Also a word to Brazil, which have some participation also online. I would like to express our sincerest thanks to be here today and sharing your knowledge, your understanding about public administration and the contemporary public modernization and reforms. I would like that this conference serve as a catalyst of the dialogue, also an instrument for learning, and a professional growth instrument for all of us here and online, not only today, but also in the following days and months, as this conference will remain on our online channel. With high expectations and open minds, we are ready to embark on this journey of discover and excellence in public administration. Once again, thank you very much, Professor Geert, for being here in ISCTE. This is also your university, so take the floor. And once again, thank you very much to be here with us.
Good afternoon, everybody, and physically present here in this room, but certainly also all the participants online. This is what changed after the pandemic, that we seem to talk to empty spaces, but there are full virtually people are there, so that's very pleasant to hear that there is a lot of people attending this session here. I first would like to thank ISCT and my colleagues, Professor Fras, David, thank you very much for your hospitality. Also, Professor Joan Salis Gomez, who also is an all-time friend and a colleague, and it's actually through him that I could be present here, and it becomes a bit of a tradition. And I'm very pleased to attend, to speak to the students. I've always been impressed by the quality of the students and their motivation and their drive to be eager to know things and new things. And from that point of view, I would like to introduce some ideas on the Neo-Weberian state. And of course, this is like a reference to history, to Max Weber. And I think history is probably one of the major features of this country here, Portugal. And it's actually also an honor and a pleasure to be here around the timing of your celebration of 50 years of democracy and a change of regime, a fundamental and peaceful change of the regime, which then triggered Portugal to join the European Union. And this is like a great story, even if it has ups and downs, as we all know. And that's why, obviously, we need a state and legal frames to further shape this future. And I would like to share with you some of the elements of reflections of the research and the comparative thinking and bench learning for you to hopefully be inspired, and for Portugal especially to be inspired by this. When I talk about Max Weber, of course, he died in 1922, which is quite some time ago. It's a century ago. So the purpose of this lecture is absolutely not to say, let's go back to Max Weber as such. In 100 years, many things have changed. That would absolutely not be the right answer to the right problems we have to address. Nevertheless, I think it's good to have a short overview, and I will not spend too much time in the slide to that. If you look at the last century and the capacity to generate knowledge about the field of public administration, and the way we have moved from administrating a state to managing a state to governing a state, it shows clearly that these changes in academic models correlate absolutely with changes in reality. And so what you see is that initially at the beginning of the 20th century, we were just talking about administrative sciences. There was no real distinction between public and private. I have had the honor to chair IIS, the International Institute of Administrative Sciences, which was founded in 1930 and has its seat in Belgium. And at that time, there was a concern to think in terms of administration, to think in it in scientific terms, but there was no distinction really between public and private. It was administrative sciences going beyond this division of public and private. And obviously, the complexity, the increased complexity of our societies required also a differentiation in the governance systems because of the contingencies. A public sector organization became quite different from a private sector organization, and let alone also from a not-for-profit organization. So you see actually bifurcations here and a kind of developing new types on this branch of knowledge on governing systems as such. First of all, in the private sector, which became also very pronounced. We're talking just before the Second World War, where the business administration was being shaped. But we see other branches and bifurcations in the development of sciences, and the issue of saying moving from a night watch state to a welfare state required developing policies. And the policies, of course, requested more than just a legal frame where you try to organize relationships between citizens and the state. You needed to run policies. And so policy sciences became a very key component in the development of sciences, mostly in the US first, to have policy science schools. And that led to a kind of remaining field of public administration, which was a bit more legal at the time and was certainly focusing on citizens and state relationships here. And then we moved, actually, as you see approximately on the scheme, in the 1970s to say there was an oil crisis, for those that remember that. And the oil crisis actually said the policies, we have to cut the policies. They're not expanding anymore, on the one hand. And on the other hand, we have to make sure that organizations were running in a more professional way the service delivery. And so that brought back the management idea in the public sector. And so public management became a very prominent element in the field and in the branches of knowledge developing in this public sphere, because in parallel now you see we have this private management, we have the policy sciences, we have public administration as such, and we have public management all simultaneously. And you see it in a kind of competition in the titles of master degrees or journals or associations. So you see a kind of academic professionalizing of this knowledge production. And that leads to a next stage, probably, to see, yes, if it's too diversing, perhaps we have to have a converging strategy too, to bring it back together, to consolidate. And the public governance has this ambition to include policies and administration and management. And so from that point of view, debates on precise definitions become a bit empty because we share an objective which we can look at from different angles. And so it's in this broad theoretical academic evolvement that we see also changes in governance systems as such. And I would like to use this context of this scheme to show you this evolution. And so if we start with Max Weber, who is a founding father, it's actually at the beginning of the 20th century, an interesting observation. At the beginning of the 20th century, we see that scientific thinking becomes very dominant. So it was really saying we are not just telling stories, we are trying to develop a scientific approach to the way we try to govern organizations. And so this scientific thinking was a very disciplinary focus element too. So initially it was the engineers that were setting the agenda. If you look, for those that are familiar with the names, Taylor, from his name we have Taylorism, and later Gulick and Urwijk. I'm not going to explain the Postcorp initiatives. I'm sure if you print it out and it's above your bed, because you can see, you never forget the Postcorp abbreviation here. But Taylor, and certainly he was not just a scientist, he was an engineer. If even in France, Fayol was an engineer. And so the metaphor was organizations are like machines. It's the machine concept of an organization. And so the issue of productivity was also to increase the productivity of machines and to transfer that idea to organizations. Max Weber was not an engineer, and Max Weber was from Germany. and Austria, Germany. The borderlines have shifted over the centuries there. And so he became a sociologist. He was an economist, a historian, a sociologist. So it's a bit of a hybrid social scientist, not an engineer. But it's quite remarkable that Max Weber also emphasized the rationality of systems. So systems had to be organized in a rational way, and rationality was the driver of the systems. So they used actually the same words of efficiency and productivity, more productivity, but to say systems are like organizations. It was a mechanistic approach, and it had to look as a machine-oriented vision of organizations. I won't tell you the whole history. I will jump all the stages. This is not a class in organization sociology. But Max Weber was crucial as a non-engineer, as a social scientist, to say the word he coined to really say the organization as a machine is a bureaucracy. And the bureaucracy was a very positive word. Now, if I would ask you, what is your connotation with bureaucracy? I've had it in the class. If you say, what are the objectives for the people? Get rid of bureaucracy. Throw bureaucracy away, reduce bureaucracy. So bureaucracy is coming a bit of a evil concept, which we want to replace and certainly want to forget. And I would like actually, and it's interesting to see that in American language, red tape is used. The word red in America has a negative connotation in some cases. But red tape should be replaced, I think, to green tape. And so from that point of view, the reference to bureaucracy, as I will design it and describe it, should get, again, a positive connotation of reliability, objective behavior, inclusion, and so on. And so if you look at the Weberian ideal space, the word ideal space is a bit of a misleading word. In German, Weber was talking about Idealtypen. And the word Idealtypen was translated in a very wrong way in English as ideal types. So if I say the word ideal, you probably think in very positive words, in terms as something we have to realize. We have to realize an ideal, but that's not the meaning of this word here. Actually, you should read ideal type here as pure type. It's a type we can think it, and because there are fragments of reality of this pure type, we can think it in a coherent way. And that's actually the objective. It's a kind of analytical tool. It's a methodology to develop pure types to better understand possible ways the reality is functioning. And for Weber, he distinguished between dimensions in society, of course, bureaucracy, which was the organizations, Wirtschaft, which is the economy. Of course, there were the businesses, and Gesellschaft, and he had debates on that under different words here too. It's society, economy, and bureaucracy. That's his typology, and it creates a space in which people are active. Of course, since Weber, as I said, it's 100 years ago, things have changed a bit, and that's an understatement to say things have changed a bit. And, it's not a closed system anymore. We emphasize open systems, and the digital, by definition, creates blurred borderlines. And so the interfaces become very blurred. Rationality, well, for those that still want to be naive, yes, rationality is still important. However, since Simon, Nobel Prize, you have to be the first to say these key words, to say, actually, rationality is a bit naive. That's not how we really think and behave. We have bounded rationality. So it's limited. Bounded rationality is one of the key concepts of Herbert Simon. We don't have to optimize maximum or minimum. We have to satisfy. The satisficing is good enough. And we are moving from certainty via risk to uncertainty. And the question is, how do we handle that? And so you see, if you look at these contexts and these elements, we see that we shifted from a praise of bureaucracy. And as I told you, the invention of, or the coining of bureaucracy at the time of Max Weber, it was a time where there was nepotism, a time where procedures were not really followed, with some abuse of power, with clans that preferred their own family members to be appointed and so on, with incompetent people. And so actually Weber said, let's get rid of that and let's have a professional organization. And so from that point of view, bureaucracy started with a very positive image, and it was clearly part of a solution of issues and systems. But it became criticized because obviously we know there is red tape and sclerosis of bureaucracies. And obviously some people who had the power in the bureaucracy abused this power. And obviously we had theories to say, you know, there are perversities in the mechanisms to develop bureaucracies, and classical theories, the public choice theories, clearly say, well, these bureaucrats only want to have optimal budgets, and for the rest, they do not care. So there was a kind of counter movement, which is quite normal in thinking, to have contradictory debates, to say the system in itself changed and got some negative features, but also from an intellectual point of view, there were other models that were being developed. And that fitted into a broader perspective, certainly since the 1970s, to say, is government part of the solution or is it part of the problem? And I think we all know that at the end of the 1970s and beginning of the 1980s, there was a kind of neoliberal movement. And we all remember Lady Margaret from the UK and Mr. Reagan in the US, who really said, you know, we emphasize the private sector and we have to limit and reduce the public sector. And so from that point of view, we see a kind of shift. H stands for hierarchy, and the legal rule of law, the bureaucracies, legally based bureaucracies, a kind of change, a dialectic change to a preference of markets, and then also to networks. M stands for market and N for networks. But I will come back to that in a while. Now, why is it all important? You could say, okay, is it nice to have systems, or is it really to copy-paste solutions of the past in a new shape, you know, to make sure we are fit for purpose? Well, I included this graph, and it's developed by OECD in 2022, taking stock of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which we have to cope. And it's interesting to see that 3 of them have to do with this public sphere and how to run systems. SDG 11 is on strong local communities, cities and communities. And of course, the reference to cities also refers to decentralization and having services and policies close to the people, the citizens. And that becomes a crucial element. And the communities refer to local networks in these communities to make sure and that's not just a tool, it's actually a strategic development goal. So it's a crucial objective, a strategic objective to have this to realize the other sustainable development goals. 16 is about strong institutions, peace and justice. And again, it's strong institutions. To have this, not just as a technique, but to have it as an objective by itself. So the strong institutions legitimize, and of course they have to have certain features for that. We will discuss what kind of features should we have to run these systems here. And 17 is partnerships. I always emphasize it's very remarkable that partnerships, you say partnerships is an instrument, it's a tool, we have to work together to do things. No, yes, also, but it is a strategic and sustainable development goal. So to have sustainable systems, we need to have partnerships. And actually 11, 16, and 17 have in common that it all requests trust. So to have trust in the systems that we believe that these systems we have or should have or will have or reform to have, that we have to be able to trust these systems. Because it's only if we trust our cities and the functioning of our cities, our communities, local communities, and if we trust our strong institutions, and if, or when, I should say, when we trust our partnerships, that we will be able to realize the other 14 sustainable development goals, which have to do with people, planet, and prosperity. And so the third P is not profit, but prosperity, which is a much broader concept here. And so the whole debate of what kind of systems do we really need to be ahead of the problems, to address and realize the SDGs as good as possible, because 2030 is getting close. And the question is, what will happen after 2030? So what kind of systems can we think to be ahead of the problems, to handle the problems, because we are not always able to solve the problems, but to handle the problems, and to be able to have a kind of trustworthy, legitimate, effective system that allows us to have functionality. And so if you look at the 1980s, you see we are moving further up, 80s and 1990s, we see actually two major movements in the reform agenda. Again, you recognize these dimensions of Max Weber, but they have different names in the dimensions. So we have the state with the public sector, we have the business, private for-profit, and we have civil society, private not-for-profit, right? It's the NGOs, it's churches, it's local communities who organize and provide services. And there has been a dynamic here in this frame to say we can move activities from the state sector to the business sector. We can move activities from the state sector to the not-for-profit sector. And so to say, if the assumption is that the public sector is too large and is not well functioning, then let's move the activities to other dimensions. And there is a kind of ideological conviction that if only we move activities to the business sector, we will be fine. Or if we move them to the civil society in certain cases, that we will be fine as long as it is not in the public sector. And so there has been a whole movement also in the taxing policies and to say, let's reduce the taxes. The lesser taxes you pay, the better. And from that point of view, it has been a clear agenda for elections in Western countries, in OECD countries over the last 20 years. And that has been one element here. So you see, activities are shifting in this field here. And of course, we have nationalization, privatization, but the trend has been really to reduce the size of the box of public. And to move it to the private for-profit and not-for-profit. And this same movement, there have been some efforts to move activities from central to local. That has happened too. So the sizes of these boxes have changed significantly. And so if I continue to this in this context to see how the recent history has evolved of the reforms starting at the end of the 1970s and the beginning of the 1980s to say there was a perceived lack of public sector performance. And I emphasize the word perceived because the measurements were not always there. It was sometimes an intuition to say it doesn't function well. And so the solution, and I put it between inverted commas here, has been that new public management was actually the solution. So it was not just management with the different managerial components, personnel management, financial management, organizational management, contract management, information management, and so on, strategic management, but to upgrade the management functions and to actually bring a kind of systemic feature where the market became a crucial element and where performance became a key driver for the reforms and to bring in performance in each management function. So we saw that the solutions here were to create agencies, and the number of agencies has expanded immensely, to give them autonomy with contracts, with an envelope, and to do their things. Performance management, I have mentioned that. I think it's about one of the, and I have contributed to this too. So I could say I'm also guilty to certain stages of emphasizing, and I do believe in performance. Let it be clear. How can we live without a performing public sector? But the market mechanisms became important. So market type mechanisms to create quasi-markets within the public sector. And that creates a kind of new situation, reducing capacity. You say, let's shift that, and shifting activities. And so in many cases, New Zealand was like a champion in realizing that. And they said, once we have that, we can go to the beach and have the party, because then all problems will be solved. What a mistake was that? What a mistake was that? Because as I've mentioned to the students present in this room, these solutions created new problems. And it became dysfunctional autonomy. Those in charge of the agency said, leave me alone. I have autonomy. Don't bother me anymore. And so there was a loss of control of central government, and it created a kind of expanding public sphere, a centrifuge. It was a centrifuge, and the center lost control, which was not the initial purpose. We focused too much on outputs because that was in the contracts, but we didn't care of what the outcomes were or the impact of these outputs. You could train unemployed people, but the purpose was for them to get a job. You know, the purpose was not to have as many courses as possible. The purpose was ultimately to look at outcomes rather than outputs. There were huge transaction costs and reforms and the reshuffling of boxes. There was gaming with the indicators, you know, with the we slowly reduced the capacity up in certain cases to have subcritical levels of capacity in the public sector. And that became very clear in the pandemic, where suddenly we realized that we had subcritical capacity in some of our key services of the public sector. And so we had to create new solutions for these problems, and it had to be coordination was one of them, to bring these agencies back together. And actually, sometimes it was re-centralization, sometimes the Australians called it suck back the agencies and the ministries. But sometimes it was other mechanisms, more soft tools. In some cases, they said the problem is that we don't have enough indicators, so more indicators. We have good audit, but not sufficient. More audit. So up to a point that people say, leave me alone. Let me do my job. I'm a professional. Consultants became very important. And I think some of you will recognize that. Private sector consultants, because there was no capacity in the public sector. And sometimes I say the consultants were very well off because they were paid and hired to say that the public sector was not functioning well. Then they were paid and hired to reduce this public sector. And now they are paid and hired because there's lack of capacity to substitute the public sector. So in each stage, they have been on the winning side, and increasingly there is a counter movement to say we have to keep capacity within the public sector. And so these solutions seemed quite okay initially. However, these solutions provoked new problems. We got like pure re-centralization, and that was not the intention. We substituted public monopolies by private monopolies. And it's quite clear that that is not necessarily a good thing. If you talk about checks and balances, you need. The networks were nice to have. They became like cosmetic networks, a part of the window dressing. The audit, well, some have been speaking about the audit society, the tsunami of audit. People said we have inspections, we have quality models, we have audits, internal audits, external audits. Leave me alone. Let me do. I'm a professional teacher, a nurse, a police person, librarian, whatever. I know what my job is, and I have a kind of professional ethic. And so we seek the substitution of the content professionals by managers. And that was not always a harmonious relationship. And then we saw distrust, an increased level of distrust within the public sector. It means actually ministries do not trust agencies. Finance obviously does not trust the line departments. Central government does not trust the municipalities and the local governments. Politics does not trust administration. And so we see a kind of institutionalized distrust within the public sector. And that's actually a terrible thing, to bring in distrust. Also for the partnerships. Can you imagine a partnership without trust? Well, if we want to realize the SDGs, we will need partnerships. Think of SDG 17. So if we will need the private sector and the not-for-profit and the public to work together in partnerships. And of course, the public sector says to the society, to citizens and companies, I want you to trust me, but of course I don't trust you. That's a very asymmetrical situation. It's very asymmetrical and it doesn't work. And so if the private sector partners, for profit and not for profit, they observe even that within this public sector, they do not trust one another within these public sectors. And so they say, but how do you want this partnership to function if you don't even trust your own public sphere actors? And if you want us to trust you, but you don't trust us. So there's a whole movement now to say, how can we reestablish trust? Reestablishing trust, I'm sure intuitively you can imagine it's easier to have distrust. You get much faster distrust than you regain trust. It's a complex thing. But we have to re-equilibrate performance-based control systems, which are based on distrust, with trust-based control systems. And do not misunderstand me. I'm not talking about naive trust here. Trust-based systems require also inspections and audits, but it should be grounded here. We will have to rebuild capacity. It's very clear. And the pandemic has shown this very obviously. And we have to consolidate whole of government and whole of society approaches. So what is an intermediate conclusion if we are at the 1990s, beginning of the 2010? The markets are useful. Yes, absolutely. We need markets to deliver services. It's not just public sector, it's public service, it's these partnerships. However, we have to be cautious. It has to be regulated. And we have to differentiate the intensity of market mechanisms according to the policy fields. Environment is different from culture, is different from education. So it depends on the capacities of our societies. Networks, yes, we desperately need networks. We need local networks, social networks. We need digital networks, but again, they need to be in one way or another regulated. We have very, I mean, the recent movements are collaborative governance, participatory governance. So all these keywords are crucial, and the networks. We need networks for that. But we have to know when and under what conditions they are functional. Hierarchies, so the legal system with a state apparatus in a legal framework, the rule of law, and in a democratic context remains crucial. That's very clear. And I think the pandemic has clearly demonstrated that the state is indispensable. But it should again be conditional here. And so the major premise here, and that's a bit of an academic attack, which is also scientifically grounded, but let me warn you, there are debates on that. It's a neoliberal framework, and it will, I think, for the sustainability of our systems, referring to the SDGs, it is not fit for purpose to combine three things. To combine routine service delivery, ensure that in an inclusive way, plus crisis governance, which will be chronicle, plus driving innovations. And so that requires a systems change. So we see, as I mentioned already, the system changes under the NPM era in the 1970s, at the end of the 1970s, 1980s and 1990s, we saw this shift from public to private. We also see reorganizations within public, between the levels, mostly decentralization. And we see that the drivers within the public sector are shifting to market type mechanisms. And so there are three bases for that. It's a kind of conjunction of mutually reinforcing elements, the academic theoretical base of economic neo-institutionalism, which has been very, very powerful, and which has been taken as for granted and almost like a standard model even in the public administration, so not just used by the economists. There is an ideological base very clearly, and it's good to have ideology. We need ideology, but it should be transparent. And the question is, what are alternatives if we debate this? It's liberalism, but liberalism has turned into neoliberalism. And it's the political reform agenda itself, which became a combination of minimize and marketize. So minimize to reduce the public sector and marketize to change the nature of the driver within the public sector. And so this is the third time I show such a space here, a three-dimensional space. So for the future, and it's also the way Pollitt and I have concluded about 40 years of public sector reform, to say ultimately it's about a governance space. This is a governance space which consists in its dimensions in pure types: hierarchy, market, and network. And this is where we then move to the models, the pure models, to see, are they fit for purpose for the future? And that's where I will come and develop new public management, new public governance, and the Neo-Weberian state. And so just to give some further information on the different dimensions, hierarchy, market, and network, and I will do this in a very limited space of time. But if you look at hierarchy as a driver, as a kind of fundamental driver of systems, what are the features? Well, it's a legally framed authority is doing that. So we're talking here about the rule of law with rights and duties for citizens. That is the core of what we are looking at. And the purpose is really to have procedures mechanisms for decision making, which are democratic and legally shaped. And you need guidance, control, and evaluation, taking into account the legal frames, the regulations for all the aspects of control systems which we need. And the role of government is to make sure this is legitimate, transparent, legitimate, trustworthy. And the checks and the balances should be part of that. And that requires certain resources, like indeed authority and legitimacy and legal systems and due process. The theoretical basis for that is the Weberian bureaucratic theories, but of course not the historical ones from the beginning of the 20th century. So that requires a kind of upgrade, and an upgrade which is fit for purpose. And that's what I will be calling the Neo-Weberian state. So it's the new version of it, the reinvented one, where we reinvent the democratic systems, upgrade the rule of law, and make it functional and compatible with regulated markets and networks. Market, I think, is a totally different driver of systems. And again, it's a pure type description here. It's supply and demand. And they meet the supply and demand, they meet or perfectly or not perfectly. And the purpose is to exchange. And in some cases, there is competition. And so, again, we can elaborate the features using the same typology here to say, it's a purchasers and providers, the markets and the typology of the markets which are regulated, and the different degrees of regulation. We have bargaining. The issue of information is very important, so that it's information on the results or the outputs, which is not always so obvious. We have money as a kind of exchange tool and instrument. There's also trust, market trust, which is a different type of trust. And so the theoretical base is institutional economics, different types of economics, the different branches here. But for our purpose here, historically, the neo-institutionalists have been very powerful and have been shaping new public management, which is the market type mechanisms here. And finally, we have the networks as the third dimension. Again, the networks has been a very popular theory and has been academically really developed. Several of the Dutch schools have impacted that. But it has also been driven not just by social networks, by digital networks. And that's about cooperation and solidarity. So it's a different game here with shared purposes. There is also elements of trust, which is the network trust. And it's a kind of cooptation in some cases of the participants based on cooperation and collaboration and participation. So network theories become very important here. And the typology, the pure type here is the new public governance with the network type of mechanisms. And so we see ultimately these state dimensions, state, business, and civil society, they shift in their volumes. And we have the governance space. These are two elements, hierarchy, markets, and networks here, which we can use to describe things. And the classical reduced scheme is to say we only have like a one-to-one relationship. The public governance uses hierarchy, the private for-profit uses the market, and the private not-for-profit uses the networks. But of course, that is too simple. It's actually much more complex. And we see that increasingly the public sphere is not just using hierarchy, but is also using markets, the quasi-markets, and networks. We have cooperative and participatory governance and decision-making. And so, but what you see during the NPM stage was this invasion of market type mechanisms and quasi markets in the public sphere, and so reducing actually the rule of law and the public law as a vehicle to structure and to drive our systems. You can say the same for private for profit. We have PPP, public-private partnerships and co-creation. And in the not-for-profit, we have the commons and the volunteers. So the systems have become more complex, as you understand. To show this in a more, in a picture, if we talk about the governance space from the NWS point of view, the Neo-Weberian state point of view, and we can discuss on the size of the cube here, but it's predominantly hierarchical, and of course it has elements and a size of market and networks, which can be smaller or bigger as we wish. NPM, New Public Management, there the governance space is totally differently filled. So it's really the market which becomes the crucial driver, and of course there are networks and hierarchies involved too, but in a secondary way. And in the NPM typology, it's the market that actually shapes the hierarchies and the networks. Just like if we talk about here, the NWS, it's the hierarchies that will shape the markets and the networks, but in NPM, it's the market that will shape the hierarchies and the networks. And if you look at the NPG, so the new public governance model, it's the networks that will shape the market and the hierarchies. So from that point of view, it's quite crucial and distinct. And the question is, from a pure type, what do we need for the future? What could actually be part of the solution or be the solution as such if we look at the next decades for our systems here? And so there is a kind of dynamic which we already observe. It's a kind of dialectic dynamic. So that's why I use this shape of dialectic evolutions. Question is, what is your concept of history? And I have a dialectic vision of history. So when we start, when the starting point is, let's say, hierarchy with the bureaucracy, the Weberian point of view, it diverted a bit to dysfunctional and negative features. And therefore, we had a kind of a collapse of the system, and it changed to markets as the dominant feature, because the markets are always right? And so the markets became strong, functional, and performing. However, we ultimately saw that markets also are failing, and that sometimes they are not part of the solution. And therefore, we needed to shift. And the shift was actually to add the networks. So the networks, it was the third way. I think in the UK, they use that word quite strongly, the third way, as a kind, not just a middle of the road issue, but it was market. Even the socialist party said the market is important, but we will have joined up government. We will have actually elements of networks here. And so the belief in networks as a panacea was quite strong, but especially also in crisis to help one another. But there was also an awareness that networks were not solving all the problems. And I think the pandemic really was a kind of eye-opener for many countries and many observers of systems to say these markets with the networks perhaps are now again collapsing and moving in a dialectic way, in a synthetic way, perhaps to say, well, we need back hierarchies, but upgraded hierarchies with markets and networks. And so when I have to define NWS, the Neo-Weberian state, from a pure type to reality, what are the features which we do not find in NPM, the New Public Management, and as market-driven, and we do not find this in the networks. It's a democratic state. Some people will say, well, it's all obvious. How can you be against it? Well, unfortunately, we observe realities where this is not obvious anymore. And so to make it explicit, I think is one of the duties of us academics. And I say also to my audiences, this is scientifically based, but it has value statements in it because we are social scientists. Social sciences are about values too. And there's nothing wrong with that, but we have to make them explicit. And so by listing this, you will see how explicit they are. So it's democratic, it's the rule of law. Again, some people will say, well, that's quite obvious. Well, I'm sorry, it's not obvious, unfortunately. And so this leads to the capacity to have open, accessible, participatory, affordable, transparent. It's a huge list. I'm aware of that. But I think by using the legal framing, we can better enforce or ensure these features more than markets and networks. It's also about responsible, accountable, and significant hierarchies. So it's not about a subcritical state. It's about a state which has capacity and that has also the capacity to regulate in a functional way markets and networks. It's about consequences, so about results we have to deliver. It's also about appropriateness. The behavior of the public sector should be appropriate. Again, it sounds very obvious, but unfortunately, it's not obvious. And so that leads to whole of government and whole of society. So NWS could guarantee much more than NPM and NPG, guarantee inclusive routine service delivery. The word inclusive is crucial here. Second, it's about effective handling of chronic crisis. So I think here there's a kind of assumption to say we are actually changing a paradigm here by combining 1 and 2. We used to have a situation where you have standard operating procedures with normal functioning of a system. Then we have a disruption with a crisis. Then we try to handle the crisis. And then we go back to normal. So it's a kind of sequence. Normal, crisis, handle the crisis, perhaps solve the crisis. Normal, back to normal, and this sequence. I think we are moving to a new paradigm, or we are already in a new paradigm, where it's not sequential, but simultaneous. So we actually have this normality of the service delivery, but in parallel, so simultaneously, we will have chronic crisis governance. And it can be turbulence if it's very heavy, stormy weather, but it will be simultaneously. And it will be a sequence of crisis. It can be health, it can be nature, it can be digital, and it can be a banking crisis. So we see kind of forward-rolling different typologies of crisis here. And to be able to combine these two, we will need innovation. We will need innovation in an entrepreneurial state to feed new types of service delivery. We will have to be creative. So social innovation, digital innovation, but also to combine it with the crisis. And so this is actually the proposition that NWS is capable of ensuring these 3 tasks, or missions or objectives. And NPM in its pure type and NPG in its pure type are not able to do this. This is a warning slide to say, when people say, well, hierarchies, are you really sure you can trust the hierarchies? Because it can pervert quite easily. It can be that it's not the rule of law, but the rule by law. That means actually elites are above the law, or which is the rule, but they use the law, or is it the other way around, the rule by law? So the law is actually running the elites and the whole organization. We observe this already in reality. It's about the democratic decision-making. We see increasingly situations where this is under pressure and where participation, collaborative governance is under pressure. We see limitations of checks and balances. And it's very clear, even in countries within the European Union, where they want to, the leadership of the executive to get control over the judicial system and nominated judges, or weaken the supreme audit institutions, you know, to say we don't want inspections and we don't want audit reports to be. And so actually damaging the checks and the balances between the branches, and also the reduced media to get control over the media. It's a very important element, which we observe, unfortunately, even in the European context. We see that hierarchies sometimes are organized not to be inclusive, but to be exclusive, to exclude parts of the population, which becomes a kind of abuse of power against certain groups in society. We see, unfortunately, political centralization and closed systems and huge polarization. And that damages also the good functioning of hierarchies. And we see hierarchies who take control over the business and over the not-for-profit too. It could be, in some cases, the military that takes over, or certain mafia groups of corrupted clans who take control over the business sector or over networks, social not-for-profit networks. So this is a kind of warning to say it requires a culture which respects the rule by law, the rule of law, I'm sorry, and the democracies. And the final point is we see the shift from weakened bureaucracies to the market and the dominance of the market. And it's interesting to see how this could happen. How do you reform so fundamentally a system? And the answers to these questions are important to see how can we, if we want the neo-Weberian state as a kind of pure model to be realized, if we want this, how should we do that? How should we make it happen? I think we can learn from the way NPM has been installed and taken for granted over all these decades. It's a combination, and I use some specific concepts from political philosophy, of a certain branch of political philosophy. So the suprastructure is crucial. That means the ideas that are very important, and ideas are represented in political ideologies. An ideology is a coherent set of ideas. So strong ideas have the capacity to change and move realities. But it's not just the political ideologies, it's also the academic disciplines. What are the dominant disciplines we think should dominate? Well, for a long time, economic institutionalism has been a very dominant academic discipline, and theory within the economic discipline. And the question is, you know, are there other disciplines that should have a stake here? The second thing is infrastructure. It's the bottom-up infrastructure that influences the ideas. And there it's very important, all the research that is done on what works and what doesn't work, this empirical evidence of what works and doesn't work impacts reform strategies. We see, that's the third element, critical junctures and bifurcations. So a crisis like a pandemic or disruptive innovations like the digital suddenly can create opportunities to change systems here. And finally, we see mechanisms that strengthen certain positions by putting them in combination. So OECD has been a very important platform to spread NPM. So countries come together, and it was almost like a therapeutic session to say, country X, why aren't you not moving to NPM? What's wrong with you? And it became a kind of political peer pressure at the technical level and at the political level. So the legitimizing platforms are very interesting. OECD had in 2015 a publication to take stock of NPM. And the title of that book was The Way Forward. It was taking stock of NPM, and the title was The Way Forward as the title. But actually, what was worse was because I read French and I compare sometimes the languages, the French translation of that study in French was La route à suivre, the way to follow. That was the French version. So the way forward was the way to follow in French. And so you see that was like a slip of the tongue to say there was an agenda there to do that. Another of these mechanisms are institutional agendas. IMF, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, the European Union. Well, I think Portugal knows the Commission very well since the financial crisis to say, this is what you're going to do. We'll twist your arm to do it. And then finally, the consultants who pays the piper calls the tune. It's a very important element to say money makes the world go round or not. And so these are elements to do that here. So can we go to the beach party now if we have this class and the NWS, and supposing that you think you have an opinion to say, oh, I'm in favor or I'm not in favor, because obviously I want to convince you, but I don't want, actually I want a debate. I think the debate is important of ultimately what kind of systems do you think we need to have for the future. There are remaining discussions, of course. This doesn't solve all of the things. So it's a kind of critical reflection from which is healthy for academia to say, is this shift, what I described as a dialectic change from hierarchy bureaucracies to thesis, anti-thesis market with some amendments with the networks to synthesis and NWS. So to have from Weberian collapse to NPM markets to then NPM plus networks plus then where the synthesis becomes a new thesis with an anti-thesis and a synthesis. So they have this zigzag evolution there. The second issue, so is this really a fundamental change or is it an incremental change? And I have debates with colleagues on this. The second is, what are the functional proportions? Because some people say you have these cubes, but why don't you make equal size for hierarchy, market, and network? You know, it's a kind of rhetorical trick. But then I say, who ultimately is in charge? What mechanism? Which mechanism ultimately has to regulate the others? Do you want a market to regulate hierarchies and networks? Do you want certain networks to regulate the markets and the hierarchies? Or do you want a sound hierarchy, I emphasize, you know, rule of law, to regulate itself and the market and the networks? That's a question. And that's an ideological question. That's a value question. So how can we combine it in a functional way? Because it can be different for the different policy fields. How do we share capacity? Because we need the partnerships, of course. We need the partnerships between the three dimensions. But how do we share? How do we do that? That's not obvious. Partnership sounds an easy word, but it's a difficult practice. And then also a crucial question, inertia. I believe in, I'm voluntaristic, so I believe in the capacity to change systems. But the path dependency is quite significant. So the history of countries is an important element for the capacity to change. The ultimate pending questions for all of us, whether you want to address them or not, the questions will come to you. A governance with or without democracy. And you will have to answer. I think for the next decades, it's very obvious that some countries say, no, democracy, it's a Western concept. It's a Western invention. We perfectly can have very good governance without democracy. I can mention some countries right now. Governance with or without government. Don't underestimate this here. Say, this is not about anarchy, but it's about libertarians. It's about libertarians. Don't underestimate this. I always give this anecdote to say I'm a Belgian, and we had for a while, 1 year and a half, 18 months, we had no federal government because we had to talk, and it didn't work well. And so suddenly I got a question from an American journal. Oh, this is great. You can have a Belgian country without government. How can we have governance without government? Can you write about this? Yes, I did write about this, and I had to say, well, we have more than one government, and I think, you know, we have some defending mechanisms. But I think it's a very serious question which we have to ask, and I think also in the US, to mention the country, I won't mention the name of the president, but the policy to the inverted commas, deconstruct the administrative state. It was an explicit policy to deconstruct the administrative state. Well, actually, this is governance without government. And so we should not underestimate that. And the third one is, and I think to the extent that you are more at the borderlines of the European Union, you feel the pressure from that. It's the degrees of development, the fragile states that collapse, and as a consequence, people run away from the countries, and they want to come to countries which are not failed states to save their life and their families and their future. And so governance and degrees of development become a crucial issue, which it's our responsibility as academics to address these three questions, which are a combination of scientific analysis and value choices here. This article was translated in Portuguese and will be distributed to everybody. The Portuguese version, certainly, if you want to read it in English, we can make it available too. But I thought it's a nice combination and possibility for the people to get exposed to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Geert Bouckaert, for your brilliant intervention, conference, and talk, which gave us an excellent overview, not only, but also about public administration history and evolution, current acquisitions, and also frameworks that we have to deal today in order to answer the challenges, not only of the SDGs, but also the SDGs, but other more deep challenges like those that you mentioned on the slides before. And this is a very useful conference to think about how to modernize nowadays and in the future the public administration. I would say we have now time for a debate. If you want to questions to Professor Geert, they will be for sure very welcome. So please, we can start. Gonçalo? Thank you.
Good afternoon. First, I have two questions. One about AI. I think it was obligated to do that question to the right person, so I'm going. So, what do you expect about the AI impact in public management, considering the lack of statements and defining red lines on which areas should or could AI invade? Because I think it's a concern. Because first, I think the public administrations was conceived to provide what services to the people. Then we came across an era of profit obsession, and now could we beginning to come across an era of robotic obsession and a robotic conceptualization of administration? And the second one is, does bureaucracy become a mechanism that increase corruption in order of consultants are constant, very, how do we say, in a way that bureaucracy could represent a weapon to the consultants become richer, if they could advise or even dictate the procedures of legislation. Are we living in a represented illusion, because they could dictate very many things, as you know? So thank you.
Yeah, maybe you can answer directly.
Thank you for two key questions, which actually should keep us awake. And I think so. The artificial intelligence is one major component as use of digital transformation, which has different elements like the databases and the data collected, and who owns and runs this. There's the aspect of the algorithms, which is a crucial one, where algorithms are developed, where it's unclear who has developed them and what the bias is in the algorithms. And the algorithms lead to decisions which have an impact on citizens for the service delivery or certain decisions. And then if you combine these big databases with the algorithms, and you have a learning mechanism within the interaction of it, you get this artificial intelligence that actually further generates data on the one hand, and new algorithms. So it's kind of second degree or third degree algorithms by itself. So it is quite obvious it has an impact not just on the public sector, but on the whole of society. So that's if you look, it has a huge, the spaces, I showed you the spaces, and I think it impacts the spaces enormously. I think for me the crucial question is, if you look at the who owns now the databases and the software, it's private sector organizations. It's actually companies which are bigger than certain states, and we have a lack of legal frames to run them. So the legal framing of regulating these are mostly absent, except for this moment where you have the European Union, the Commission, and also in the US, where they start regulating and shaping these companies. But then you have immediately a huge tension between ideologies to say, let it be free, and let them go. So that's an ideological position. The second tension is the competitive position between Europe and China, of non-Western or Russian for that matter, and American interests to get control over markets and behavior of people. And so this becomes like an existentialist question, where the state is not able anymore to protect the citizens. And so if I come back to my government space, the question then is, whom do you think should ultimately regulate these phenomenons, which I think we need. I think we have to develop them, and we need them for the purpose. It's part of the digital innovation. We will need them for service delivery in the future, and also to solve crisis. We saw clearly in the pandemic. We saw clearly that the use of the databases and the algorithms helped to contain movements and the spread of disease. And so we have to develop that further, but it should be transparent and it should be legally framed. So the question is, well, when I say legally framed, I already take a position to say it's the hierarchy who should do that. Because then, my question is, there are three options here. Or you let the markets write the legislation and they control the networks, or you let the networks take over the markets and the hierarchies, or you let a democratic rule of law based legal system and state to regulate the markets and the networks. But of course, I already said that the states already lost control. So it's not solvable at the level of the states. So we have to move one scale up. At this moment, within the United Nations, they're already working. There's a working group to see how, let's say, universal legislation could be developed on this as a kind of new tool. Yes, well, it's a kind of international agreements. Supranational. Yes, to actually shape, and it is possible. We already have mechanisms and treaties to contain that.
Do you think that will be the movement? Because we are nowadays seeing that for the first time in the history of the states, that some companies have more information about the citizens of each state than the state, the country. Do you think an issue, an instrument to deal with that situation will be that supranational governance in those kind of institutions?
I think there will be a positive and a negative strategy here. The positive strategy will be kind of supranational treaties and agreements. That's the positive shaping. The second one, and that's because the two elements, databases, algorithms, and artificial intelligence, are used for defense or for military purposes. Countries will protect themselves and forbid and close things. Or they will use it for their own purposes. And so there will be negative strategies to limit and to cut off, and there will be positive strategies to facilitate and to regulate. But it's, for me, it's clear that we need legal shaping for this and political agreements. And as I told you already, there is a geopolitical tensions which are immense, and so this is beyond a single country here. I have advised also, supreme audit institutions have to audit the state, and so they lose absolutely control over these things, databases and decisions. We have seen already some scandals. Catastrophes, not just scandals, but catastrophes in the Netherlands, the combination of databases and algorithms and artificial intelligence, deciding on subventions for people, mostly weak people, poor people, people in need, who then were losing their rights to claim a subsidy or whatever, or a permit. And so systematically were ignored. That was in the Netherlands. We see the same in Australia, Robodebt. In Australia, it's a huge catastrophic scandal where this actually the replacement by street level bureaucrats by automatic databases generating through algorithms, calculating the money people can get or had get and then had to return. Then the returning of the money was contracted out to companies who got 10% on the money that they could return. So there was huge abuse of power to have this 10%, and it created enormous social disasters.
And the issue of accountability.
Yes, but also the rights of citizens. The same in the UK with the postal offices, resulting again in the same situation. So I think the public sector will have to put order in its own, what it governs itself. So we're not talking about these mega companies and secret services or big companies used in the benefit of certain countries in their defense or foreign policies. We're talking about service delivery by certain countries. And so audit offices don't have the capacity to audit this anymore. It transcends their possibilities. And so I've actually said, perhaps we need an agency at the level of the supreme audit institutions of the European Union to together, because it's a shared problem, and individual countries cannot solve it anymore. That's your first question, and I'm not sure if I answered it. The second, on the consultants, I think it's you're hitting the nail on a painful spot in what is happening in our countries in the European Union, certainly. And I mentioned already that consultants benefit at least 3 times. First, to say that the public sector is too big and doesn't function well, then to reduce the public sector, and then to say, oh, there is not enough capacity and we will fill the gaps. So they 3 times already they pass through the money machine so I think the counter movement has started, and I think we are desperately in need for internal government within the public sector consultancy capacity. And I think the last under the Belgian presidency, I will say something very positive on the Belgian presidency. There was the Ghent declaration, where explicitly was said, and the Commission agrees with that, to build capacity within the public sector to deliver consultancy services to the public sector. So by the public sector, for the public sector, and to make and to create capacity for that. I always say contracting out your brains is never a good idea, and so we need to do that. And to the extent that even consultants or law firms start writing the legislation, I think then we really are in trouble. So if the public sector and the state is not able to write its own legislation, and of course it's also in the tension between the branches. Parliaments vote legislations which are not always fit for purpose, and as a consequence, And sometimes it's part of political compromising to make ambiguous texts or texts which have too many escapes. And then it's actually de facto a kind of delegating power to the judges. And then the judges are blamed to say, you are activist, you are an activist judge. And so then there's attack on the judicial system. And what you see is actually, instead of having checks and balances between the branches, the tensions lead to a kind of negative spiral with mutually weakening executive and legislative and judicial. And so that creates a democratic deficit, ultimately. So that's my reply. It's not really an answer, it's a reply to your, and I share your concern.
Thank you. Before we continue in the room, I will have here some questions from people that is following us online. Edgar Fernandes asked the question: the public sector managed by private business does not lead to the socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor, in the terms that public services produced by the government are not for people who more need it? It's the question. Yes, I think we can go question by question.
I think it's a concern I share, and to avoid this negative spiral, it's actually to say inclusion becomes important. Inclusion is a crucial concept in the SDGs and in our policies. Unfortunately, what we see, and I have mentioned that, is intentionally excluding parts of society. And if you look at surveys, trust levels, satisfaction, the general feeling of citizens, you see a huge feeling of being excluded, and it impacts the trust immensely. OECD has, in its survey for trust, added a new vector, a new dimension, pillar, I could say, for trustworthiness. So it included already, are you able to deliver services, the capacity to do that, to be part of the problem, to solve crisis, to be benevolent, integrity, and all of that. But they have added one major dimension. It's actually the feeling of citizens that they are included, and that the public sector takes their opinions into account. It's very clear that not all citizens want to participate in all types of policy fields. That's not the case. Of course, you have people who want to volunteer and so on, but everybody wants to have a voice and to be taken into account. And so it's about not just listening, it's also about listening plus learning and adjusting administrative systems and taking the opinions of people into account. I think the inclusion policies are crucial, and that's part of appropriate government. And so in this case, we should ask ourselves the question, which model has the best assets to ensure that? Is it the pure market model or not? Is it the pure network models? Networks are not necessarily inclusive, or not? Or is it a hierarchical model, which has some risks, but I mentioned them, so we have to be aware of that, where a legal, you can write it in a constitution, and some constitutions have included, the Portuguese constitution too, included certain rights, social rights too, economic rights. It's another chapter to realize them, but at least it's a kind of protected level. And we see increasingly in some countries to write some liberal democracies and liberal rights into the constitution, when we talk about abortion, for example, and it becomes huge debates in certain countries. So I think that we should ask our question, the question you ask, which system can ensure that these things do not happen and that we have an inclusive policy and service delivery? Is it ultimately hierarchy, ultimately the market, or is it ultimately the networks? In my opinion, it's the hierarchy.
I will give the opportunity in the room to have more questions now.
Yeah, okay. In your classes, you talked about the culture, the very importance of the culture in all the countries. My question is about the society, the civil servants. If you had Portugal with a high level of literacy in economics, finance, and politics, should you? The question is this rulable? If we have a high level of literacy, everyone understands literacy and economics and finance, which could a government rule in Portugal, or would it be like an anarchy? Because when we have a writer in Portugal, as the CIES, is Fernando Pessoa, that has a character named Alberto Cairo, that says the happy is the ignorance. And I think that if we have a lot of population with a lot of knowledge, it should be difficult to rule and to govern that people.
Maybe we can have, as we have two questions already there in the room.
Good afternoon, class. My question is, what is the relationship between the Neo-Weberian state and new public management?
I don't know if someone in the room wants to do other questions.
I would like to ask because I'm reading a text from Robert and Janet Denhart about new public service, and I would like to situate that concept in the new Weberian state. I think it's similar, but I would like to know.
Maybe as we have 3 questions already, you can answer, please, and comment.
Well, thank you for the culture question. I think so. Literacy or understanding the system, is it ultimately positive or negative, or you know, the Pessoa reference is I didn't know this quote from Pessoa, but that he said that I'm sure he applied it to himself too. It's interesting to see. I also remember one of the sentences of Pessoa in one of his poems where he talked about justice. He's saying, I cut into an oranja. I cut into the oranja, and then the question was, does it matter if I cut it in half in a good way or in a bad way if I eat the orange myself, the total orange myself? It doesn't matter if you cut it well or not well. So it's about transparency and taking decisions. It's about informing people on what to do, and ultimately the dark side of what you're saying is, can people are people sufficiently educated to discover the fake versions of reality and news? Because you could say, yes, if they are understanding the system, perhaps it's easy for them then to discover fake news, and then to in a transparent way to defend and to reply or to adjust their behavior in voting or in responding in protesting or whatever. I think it's probably it would be a depressing idea to say if only they are ignorant, we will be happy. I think it's not, from an academic point of view in the university, it's probably not the right position to take. And some institutions have organized themselves to make sure that the people were not too much informed. And so that's, we know histories from some institutions who actively did that. I won't mention some institutions, but I think you know what I'm telling and talking about. I have visited many countries and many cultures, and I remember one situation in China where I was talking about trust and transparency. And so one of the Chinese students asked me, so if we have more transparency, will we have more trust? And I had to answer, actually, no, not necessarily. Because if the transparency leads to discovering all the corruption and suddenly make the corruption visible, your trust will collapse. But at least you will know it, and then you will be able to adjust your behavior. Well, I didn't want to start a revolution in that class, but I must say it was a full room, and it was quite interesting that everybody understood what I was saying. And so from that point of view, I think it's very good that we have contradictory debates, that we have informed citizens to take decisions or to discover fake news and respond to that. That would be my reply. The relationship of NWS and NPM. Well, I showed you a kind of historical relationship to say we are probably, but that's my reading of history in a dialectic way, like moving from a market-driven NPM from a bureaucracy, which is already thesis, antithesis, to synthesis. And the synthesis is then perhaps adding the networks in one way or another, and then saying, okay, this is also not, the synthesis becomes an antithesis by itself, and you need, or a thesis by itself, and you need an antithesis to say the crisis and the crisis governance, which then in a synthesis leads to NWS. So the sequence of thesis, antithesis, synthesis is a dialectic way of analyzing history in general. And I have been applying this to our field here. So that's one way. It's a kind of time relationship where you have alternations. And the question is it a fundamental paradigm change, or is it incremental? And we can debate on that, and perhaps in different countries it will be a different answer. The second one is of course an analytical relationship, to say if we create a governance space, I design it with 3 dimensions: hierarchy, market, and network. And some people accept these 3 dimensions as 3 distinct dimensions. And so the relationship then between NPM and NWS is that it's 2 sides of the space which you have, and they interact with one another, and they are combined. And you have a degree of freedom to let them interact and combine them. That would be my answer. So time and analytics. Your question is a very good one. Thank you very much. And the Den Haarts are friends of mine, so I know the Den Haarts quite well. And it's so the labels. The question is, what is covered by the labels? Because you also have public value theories. So there are many theories. There's a good book by Torfing. I'm making publicity for a book, Torfing et al. It's different. And so they try to summarize the dominant theories in the 20th century. And it was of course, the classical ones, Weberian, Neo-Weberian, NPM, NPG, which is the networks, but also they added also professionalism. So the professional as a kind of separate school of thought. The digital one is also a separate school of thought. Public value was also one of them. I think personally, well, I don't mind. You have grand theories, middle range theories, and micro theories. Actually, I want to think of, and perhaps the authors would disagree with me when I say that what I have been presenting is a grand theory with the big spaces, and within that you can have emphasis on professionals, on digital, on public value, on service, public service. So I think there's a kind of hierarchy in the ambition of what do you want to reach, and I support and I admire the theories of the Denhards. I think it's an important way. And I think you can actually fit them to say, if you want to deliver these public services, what would be the best governance space to do that? So how can you plug it into this governance space? And so you get a kind of hierarchy of thoughts, of frameworks, intellectual frameworks. That's actually my... So it's not, is it in favor of it, against? It's actually, it's like the dolls, you know, you open a doll and there's a new doll. And so if you open the governance space doll, you find another doll.
There was a time also. Right?
Yes, no, I think it's, you know, there are fashions too, so it's there are time scales too. That's why I started with a time scheme of how ideas evolve, and of course these theories are developed at moments where there is pressure or there is a need to emphasize that. And public sector and public service, it's also the evolution of a bureaucracy and moving to partnerships in a way to collaborate.
Thank you. I think we could have one last round of questions. I have one here from online, from an old friend, Bento Carvalho, which I get this opportunity to regarding. He asks, given the fact that hierarchy is given its legitimacy by democracy and by elections, can public administration goals be set by networks of representative stakeholders instead from elected officials?
Thank you. This is really also a core question. And what we see is a kind of transition of our political system or pressure on our political system. And of course, in the Western world, we have majoritarian systems and proportional systems. But what they have in common is that they are representative democracies. And so what we see is that the representative democracies are being questioned. And sometimes they are questioned in a fundamental way that you want to replace them with a participatory democracy or by democracy by lottery. You know, it's a lottery system and that's the parliament. Or you have your 1,000 citizens which are coming together and decide with the potential of a bias, of course, because, you know, who has time to do that and so on. And so the question is, from my point of view, how can we strengthen representative bureaucracy? But some people think we have to replace it because the representative bureaucracy has some weaknesses. and we should and we know the weaknesses in a majoritarian system. It's the alternations, and if then it's combined with polarization, it becomes unworkable. And we see and elections do not solve it, because in some countries we've seen after each 3-4 months a new election, and that didn't solve the issues. So that's a problem with the representative democracy, I'm sorry. But also the proportionality, we see a huge fragmentation of parties, which then make it unmanageable to make a majority. And I think, and it leads to a minority of governments, and I'm sure you're familiar with that. And so these two perversions of representative democracy have actually resulted in a kind of pushing alternatives like democracy by lottery or other kinds of participatory democracy. And the Commission, European Commission, has been supporting this. And I think the crucial question is it strengthening the representative democracy, or is it substituting the representative democracy? From my point of view, it should strengthen it and not substituting it. So that's a very clear positioning I'm taking. I hope that's part of the answer. And the second point I want to add to that is, it's not sufficient to take democratic decisions. It's also about implementation. And so this implementation becomes very crucial here, because that's the proof of the pudding. Is it being implemented? And so you could have a kind of boomerang effect when people who support participatory democracy and direct democracy, when the decisions are taken but not implemented. And so my position here is that you need to complement the upgrading of our democratic systems with collaborative governance. So the collaborative governance means it's an open bureaucracy where you include citizens in the design, in the decision, in the implementation, in the evaluation. So it's the code design. Some will remember the co-design, co-decide, co-implement, co-produce, co-create, and co-evaluate as a kind of open system. And it means actually collaborative governance, that the administration accepts, let's say, citizens, partnerships, involvement of stakeholders to collaborate in co-producing services in a policy cycle context. That requests a cultural change. And so we have to look at the two sides of the coin, the decision-making and the implementation. And both have to be upgraded. And so the governance space has to be activated to make that happen.
We have just time for final questions. I don't know if someone wants to ask. Okay, another question.
I'm sorry to make you that question, but it's kind of a politic question. Would you think it would be easier if you have NWS system of governments in Portugal with a Socialist Party or a Democrat Party? Would it be easier? Which one of them?
I have been studying reforms over 40 years in 12 countries, right? One of the lessons I learned is there is no one-to-one relationship between a political party and a position in public management reform. I have seen seeing alternation. So alternating from conservative, for example, in the UK, from conservative to socialist, or in Australia from socialist to conservative. And that did not necessarily mean a total reverse of the reforms. So in many cases, the reforms were kept and there were some amendments or changes. So there was a rather significant stability in the reform agendas, especially in Anglo-Saxon countries. That's my first remark. My second comment is right and left have changed meanings too over time. And so we see situations where suddenly a conservative Christian Democrat party is almost like a left-wing party compared to extreme right-wing parties or conservatives that become very right-wing. And so on the scale of left and right, and we have to make a distinction between economic left and right and the moral policies, you know, and of LGBT, abortion, and so on. So the morality issues and the economic issues, they do not coincide. So some parties are right on the one agenda and left on the other agenda, of you know, of tolerating it. So I would avoid in the left-right debate. We see combinations according to the different types of policies, economic or morality. So it's not necessary that both are chosen on the right or on the left. So that, and we see parties shifting on the scale where traditionally left-wing parties become almost right-wing parties. And so that's a kind of, if not a surprise, at least something to be taken into account. And so it means the word socialist, you cannot necessarily predict. You have to talk about which specific party in which country and how it has changed over time and taken positions there and which coalitions it's wanted to take. I always say, as a kind of terrible observation, nationalism, because you have nationalist parties too, most nationalist parties are right-wing. There are some exceptions. In Scotland, the Nationalist Party was left-wing, but that was because London was right-wing. So it was, and you find it in Spain too. So there are, so it's complicated to talk. But there has been a time where nationalism, right-wing nationalism, and socialism were connected. It was called National Socialism in Germany. So sometimes the combinations become explosive and unexpected. And so it's quite clear that some extreme right-wing parties have very left-wing social policies, at least in their before the elections. And so les extrêmes se touchent, extremes, extreme left and extreme right in the field of social policies sometimes meet perfectly, and voters get confused there, and so then they decide on other things. Because I'm not trying to avoid to answer your question, but I'm trying to unpack your question to say I hesitate to give an answer because of the uncertainties, and I'm and it's not necessarily the case that left-wing are more reformist and conservatives are by definition not for reforms. That's in fact, that's not the case. Think of Lady Margaret. You know, she was conservative and she was one of the highest activists in reform. Of course, the reform was directed in which direction? To have less government. And so the question is, what is the purpose of the reform here? I hope I unpacked the question in a good way.
Yeah, and we have in Portugal that situation because new public management reforms in the last in the end of the last century and the beginning of this century were put in practice by PSD party in Portugal that is more conservative in 2002, 2003, deepest. Of course, we already have some measures of new public management, but at that time it was deepest. And then Durão Barroso went to European Union Commission, and then comes a socialist party. And the more deepest reforms continued in public management in 2007, 2008 with the Socialist Party. And it's curious because after, in the context of Troika and with the government more on the right, more liberal, we become more, I would say, Neo-Weberian, because we want to control the state, put in control all the mechanisms of the market that in the discourse we lose the control. And of course, it was also an issue of money and to pay under the Troika agreements. But it highlights what you were saying here in Portugal and in our reality. In fact, we have both the situations, conservatives being more Neo-Weberian, and also socialists becoming more liberal with new public management reforms in depth.
One anecdote, Tony Blair is a socialist, right, in the UK. And so a socialist, but supporting market economy. And he was for a while very popular in China. The Chinese loved him. So I have attended meetings. Blair was invited by the top leadership of the Communist Party, the Chinese Communist Party, because they wanted to bring in market mechanisms in the Shanghai Special Economic Zone. And so they said, we perfectly can be socialist, the Chinese, so being communist, and support the market. And Blair is an example that it is possible. So what you see is not always what you get. That's actually my point.
So we come to the end, dear Professor Geert, dear participants in the room, online. I would like to thank you very much on the behalf of our rectory and our community of ISCTE and public administration, public policy, specifically community. I would like to express our deepest gratitude for your brilliant conference and valuable insights that you shared with us, not only today, but during the week and during all your professional life as a professor. It is for us, as I said many times, an honor to have you here in our master program and sharing not only with master students, but also with civil servants, top level and middle level managers in public administration, also politicians, and all the international community that follow us in the internet, Portuguese spoken countries, but not only. I'm sure your inspiring words will resonate on the minds of each of our students and also of our civil servants. And I sincerely hope that in the next academic year, we could have the opportunity to have you here once again and have all the knowledge and the approaches of evaluations that we have done in a simple way, but about very complex issues. So thank you very much to be here and to share your knowledge with us.
And I would like to wish you another 50 years of democracy and beyond to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the democracy, and the next 50 years start in very good circumstances, because I have been teaching bright students that are very motivated to start realizing the next 50 years of a performing Portugal in a democratic context. Thank you very much and good luck.
That's a good hand. Thank you very much.